HOA Karen took me to court over my shed, so I countersued and won her house. Entitled people read at Karen's Kingdom, the fall of a tyrant HOA president. The gavel came down with a thunderous crack that echoed through the packed courtroom like a gunshot. Karen Peton, the once mighty HOA president of Maple Grove Estates, collapsed into her chair like a deflated balloon, her perfectly manicured nails, each one costing more than most people's weekly groceries, digging into the polished oak table as my lawyer, David Hutchinson, slid a deed across to our side with the satisfied smile of a man who had just delivered justice on a silver platter. Outside the courthouse steps 20 minutes later, I stood quietly in the afternoon sun, holding a set of keys in my calloused hands. They weren't just any keys, they were the keys to her 4,000-square-foot mansion on Sycamore Drive, complete with its Italian marble foyer, chef's kitchen with custom cabinetry, and that infamous Japanese garden that would become the centerpiece of her downfall. My name is Alex Morrison, and I'm a mobile mechanic. 3 months ago, I built a simple 10 by 12 shed in my backyard to store tools and auto parts for my business. It was nothing fancy, just a practical structure painted sage green to match my house trim, with basic shelving and a workbench where I could organize my equipment. The morning after I finished construction, feeling proud of my weekend project, I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door like a scarlet letter. The signature at the bottom belonged to Karen Peton, and that single piece of paper would set off a chain of events that nobody in our neighborhood would ever forget. The calm before the storm. I'd lived in Maple Grove Estates for 5 years without any issues. The HOA had always been reasonable under the previous president, Mrs. Henderson, who treated residents like neighbors rather than subjects. They'd approved my requests for minor landscaping changes, even complimenting my well-maintained lawn and the small vegetable garden I'd planted along the back fence. The monthly meetings were cordial affairs where genuine community issues were discussed, street lighting, snow removal, and the annual block party. But everything changed when Karen took over as president 6 months ago. She ran on a platform of maintaining property values through strict enforcement, and she meant business. Within weeks of her election, violation notices flooded the neighborhood for infractions nobody knew existed. Mailboxes were suddenly the wrong shade of black. Apparently, midnight black was acceptable, but charcoal black was not. Garden gnomes violated the newly interpreted decorative statute limitations. One neighbor, elderly Mrs. Patterson, received a fine because her trash cans were visible from the street for 37 minutes instead of the allowed 30. But my shed, my humble, practical shed, became her personal crusade. The first shot fired. The first notice demanded immediate removal for violating the visual harmony clause in Section 12.4 of the HOA bylaws. I read that section 3 times, trying to understand how my shed disrupted any harmony. It was tucked behind my house, barely visible from the street, and significantly smaller than the elaborate playsets and gazebos scattered throughout the neighborhood. I responded professionally, providing photos from multiple angles, measurements, and documentation proving the shed met all local building codes and fell comfortably within the size restrictions outlined in our covenants. I even included a letter from the city's building department confirming that no permits were required for structures under 120 square feet. Karen's response came in the form of a $50 daily fine that would accumulate until the structure was removed. No discussion, no compromise, no acknowledgement of my documentation. Just a cold, calculated escalation that revealed her true nature. The battle lines are drawn. I tried reasoning with her at the next HOA meeting. Standing before the board with my folder of permits and approvals, I explained how the shed was essential for my livelihood. As a mobile mechanic, I needed a secure, organized space to store expensive diagnostic equipment, specialty tools, and parts inventory. Without it, my business would suffer, and by extension, so would my ability to maintain my property to HOA standards. Karen sat at the center of the board table like a queen holding court, her lips pursed in a permanent frown that seemed to be her default expression. She wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and her perfectly styled blonde hair didn't move even when she shook her head dismissively. Running a business from a residential property, she said with a condescending tone that dripped with disdain, is exactly the kind of industrial blight the HOA exists to prevent. We simply cannot allow Maple Grove Estates to become a commercial district. When I pointed out that I only stored tools there and did all actual work at clients' locations, she waved her hand dismissively, her tennis bracelet catching the fluorescent lights. The board has already decided, she declared, as if democracy itself was merely a suggestion in her kingdom. The other board members, previously reasonable people, sat in uncomfortable silence. Later, I'd learned that Karen had systematically intimidated them into compliance, threatening to find violations on their own properties if they didn't support her decisions. The fines keep coming. The fines kept accumulating like compound interest. $50 a day turned into $100 when I didn't comply after 2 weeks. Karen's reasoning was that my continued defiance showed disrespect for the community and required enhanced penalties. By the end of the first month, I owed $3,000. My requests for mediation were ignored. My emails went unanswered. When I tried to speak at the next board meeting, Karen had security escort me out, claiming I was being disruptive before I'd even said a word. The security guard, a young man who seemed embarrassed by the whole situation, apologized quietly as he walked me to the parking lot. "She's lost her mind," he whispered, glancing back at the community center. "I've never seen anything like this." That's when Karen made her biggest mistake. She filed a lawsuit seeking a court-ordered demolition of my shed, plus $10,000 in accumulated fines and legal fees. The hubris was breathtaking. She truly believed she was untouchable. The counterattack begins. The court summons arrived on a Tuesday morning. As I read through the lengthy document filled with legal jargon about covenant violations and property devaluation, something inside me snapped. Not in anger, but in cold, calculating determination. If Karen wanted a legal battle, I'd give her one she'd never forget. I called my friend David Hutchinson, who'd recently passed the bar exam and was hungry for his first real case. We met at a local coffee shop where I spread out every document, email, and notice I'd received. David's eyes lit up as he reviewed the material, especially when he noticed inconsistencies in how the HOA applied its rules. "This is harassment," he said, tapping his pen against the table. "And I think we can prove it." We spent the next 2 weeks building our defense and something more. David suggested we research Karen's property for compliance issues, reasoning that someone so obsessed with rules might have bent a few herself. What we found exceeded our wildest expectations. The investigation deepens. Using public records and aerial photography from the city planning department, we discovered that Karen's home had several unpermitted additions. Her covered patio exceeded size restrictions by nearly 40%. Her decorative fountain required permits she never obtained. Most damning of all, her prized Japanese garden included a koi pond that violated both HOA rules and city ordinances regarding water features. But the real gold mine came from other neighbors. Once word spread that I was fighting back, people started approaching me with their own stories of Karen's tyranny. Robert from Oak Street showed me emails where Karen threatened him with fines unless he supported her election bid. The messages were startling in their brazenness. She demanded he display her campaign signs and contribute to her election fund, or face increased scrutiny of his property. Patricia from Elm Avenue had security footage of Karen measuring her hedges at 6 a.m., looking for violations. The footage showed Karen with a measuring tape and clipboard, documenting every inch of Patricia's landscaping like a detective gathering evidence. Tom from Birch Lane revealed that Karen had tried to fine him for his wheelchair ramp until he threatened to sue for discrimination. She'd claimed the ramp violated the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood, apparently unaware that ADA compliance trumped HOA bylaws. We had a pattern of harassment and selective enforcement that would make any judge take notice. The counterstrike. David filed our countersuit 2 days before the initial hearing. We alleged harassment, defamation, and abuse of power. We sought damages for lost business due to stress, legal fees, and punitive damages for what we characterized as a targeted campaign of intimidation. Karen's lawyer, an expensive attorney named Richardson from downtown, seemed genuinely surprised when he received our filing. He'd probably expected an easy win against a mechanic representing himself. Now, he faced a hungry young lawyer with a mountain of evidence and nothing to lose. The discovery process revealed even more damaging information. Karen had kept detailed files on every resident, noting their political affiliations, income levels, and what she considered their social value to the community. She'd ranked neighbors on a scale of 1 to 10, with mechanics, teachers, and other service workers receiving the lowest scores. The first hearing was supposed to be a simple matter of determining whether my shed violated HOA rules. Instead, it became a revelation of Karen's systematic abuse of power. David presented our evidence methodically, building a case that would have made Perry Mason proud. First, he showed that my shed met every objective standard in the HOA bylaws. Then, he demonstrated how Karen had approved similar or larger structures for other homeowners, particularly those who supported her politically or contributed to her campaigns. The judge's expression grew increasingly skeptical as David revealed the pattern of selective enforcement. Judge Morrison, no relation, despite the shared surname, was known for his no-nonsense approach to HOA disputes, having dealt with numerous cases of board overreach. When Richardson tried to argue that the HOA board had discretion in interpreting visual harmony standards, David countered with Karen's own emails to board members, obtained through discovery. In one particularly damning message, she explicitly stated her intention to drive out the riffraff who bring down our property values. In another email, she mentioned targeting homeowners who didn't contribute to my campaign and suggested that a few well-placed fines would help them reassess their priorities. The truth comes out: the courtroom atmosphere shifted palpably. Karen's confident posture wilted as she realized her private communications were being read aloud in open court. Her face flushed red, then pale, as the full extent of her written admissions became clear. The turning point came when David introduced evidence of Karen's own violations. Richardson objected furiously, arguing that Karen's property had nothing to do with my shed. But Judge Morrison allowed it, noting that selective enforcement claims required examining how rules were applied across the board. David presented city records showing Karen's unpermitted additions, complete with aerial photos and inspector reports that had mysteriously disappeared from official files. He then showed emails where Karen had pressured a city employee to lose the paperwork, promising HOA support for his cousin's contracting business. The courtroom fell silent as David revealed the extent of Karen's violations. Her koi pond alone required 3 separate permits she'd never obtained. The covered patio exceeded size restrictions by 40%. Peton, the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, you've held your neighbor to standards you clearly don't apply to yourself. This court finds that deeply troubling. The judge called a recess, but everyone in the courtroom knew which way the wind was blowing. During the break, I overheard Richardson urgently whispering to Karen about settling. She refused with a haughty tone, insisting the judge would see reason. Her delusion persisted even as former board members testified about her vindictive behavior and manipulation of HOA funds to target specific homeowners. When internal HOA emails revealed she'd spent association money on private investigators to find violations, even Richardson looked defeated. The verdict came 2 weeks later. Judge Morrison not only ruled in my favor regarding the shed but found that Karen had engaged in a pattern of harassment and abuse of power. She'd violated her fiduciary duty as HOA president, misused association funds, and committed defamation by spreading false claims about my business practices to neighbors. The damages were comprehensive: $60,000 in actual damages for lost business and emotional distress, $40,000 in punitive damages to discourage future abuse of power, and all my legal fees, which had grown substantial as the case expanded. In total, Karen owed me $137,000. But that wasn't the end. Judge Morrison referred the matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges related to the missing city permits and pressure on city employees. The fall of an empire. The HOA board held an emergency meeting that very evening. By unanimous vote, they removed Karen from her position and banned her from serving in any HOA capacity for life. Board members who had remained silent during her reign of terror finally found their voices, expressing relief at her removal. Her real estate license came under review when the state board learned about her ethical violations. Within a month, she'd lost her position at the prestigious Maple Grove Realty firm where she'd worked for 15 years. Karen tried to appeal, of course. She hired an even more expensive lawyer and filed motions claiming judicial bias and procedural errors. But the appeals court upheld every finding, noting that the trial judge had shown remarkable restraint given the egregious nature of her conduct. The final blow: the legal bills mounted. Combined with the damages she owed me, Karen faced financial ruin. She'd leveraged her house to fund her legal battles, convinced she'd win and recoup everything. Now the bills came due. The foreclosure notice appeared on her door 3 months after the verdict. The bank wanted their money, and Karen's savings had evaporated in legal fees. Her house, the crown jewel of Maple Grove Estates, went to auction. David called me the morning of the sale with an interesting proposition. Why not bid on it, he asked. The poetic justice would be perfect. The idea was too tempting to resist. Using part of the settlement money, I placed the winning bid at 70% of market value. Nobody else wanted to deal with the karma of buying Karen's former domain. The keys to the kingdom. The look on Karen's face when she learned I'd bought her house was worth every penny of the legal battle. She stood in the courthouse parking lot, clutching the eviction notice, her usually perfect composure completely shattered. "You've ruined my life over a stupid shed," she screamed, her voice echoing off the building walls. But as David reminded her, she'd ruined her own life through abuse of power and vindictive behavior. The shed was just the catalyst that exposed her true nature. New beginnings. I took possession of the house on a sunny Thursday morning. The locks had been changed, and Karen's possessions were gone, moved to a storage unit pending her retrieval. As I walked through the empty rooms, I didn't feel vindication or joy, just a sense of completion. This house, built on a foundation of intimidation and selective enforcement, would serve a better purpose. That afternoon, I signed a lease with Veterans Haven, a local nonprofit that provides transitional housing for homeless veterans. The rent was minimal, just enough to cover taxes and maintenance. The first veterans moved in 2 weeks later. Watching these men and women who'd served our country find shelter in Karen's former palace felt like cosmic justice. The meditation pavilion she'd built illegally became a therapy space. The koi pond, properly permitted now, provided peaceful reflection for people dealing with PTSD. Her gourmet kitchen served community meals instead of hosting power broker dinners. The aftermath. As for Karen, she disappeared from Maple Grove Estates. Some said she moved in with her sister in another state. Others claimed they'd seen her working at a department store 2 towns over. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that the neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of unchecked power. The HOA reformed its bylaws to prevent future abuses. Board members now faced term limits. Rule enforcement required documented warnings and appeal processes. The visual harmony clause got specific, measurable standards instead of subjective interpretations. My shed still stands in my backyard, painted sage green and filled with tools. Business has actually improved since the trial. Turns out, standing up to a tyrant earned me respect and new customers throughout Maple Grove. People trust a mechanic who fights for what's right. Full circle. The entire saga lasted 6 months from the first violation notice to me holding those keys, 6 months that transformed our neighborhood from a place of fear and arbitrary enforcement to a community that looked out for each other. Karen thought she could bully a simple mechanic into submission. Instead, she learned that power built on intimidation is as fragile as a house of cards. One small shed brought down her entire empire. They say justice is blind, but sometimes it has a sense of humor. Karen lost her house, her position, her career, and her reputation because she couldn't tolerate a 10 by 12 shed. The judge ordered her to pay 300 hours of community service for the permit violations. The state real estate board suspended her license for 5 years. Her HOA lifetime ban meant she could never again wield petty power over her neighbors. As she stood in that courthouse parking lot, watching me drive away with her house keys, the reality hit her like a physical blow. She'd lost everything, and her scream of fury echoed off the building walls as tears streamed down her face, the final, pathetic end of Karen's kingdom. The veterans at her old house still bring their vehicles to me, and I give them fair prices. Some evenings, I'll see them sitting by the koi pond, finding peace in a place that once symbolized oppression. Karen's kingdom had fallen, but from its ashes rose something far more valuable, a true community built on respect, fairness, and justice. And my shed? It stands as a monument to the truth that sometimes the smallest things can topple the mightiest tyrants.